Today on the Mr. Maple Show podcast, Tim and Matt discuss the amazing world of Japonicums.
All right, y'all, welcome to the Mr. Maple Show podcast. We've got a fun episode for you here today. Today, Tim and I are going to be talking a little bit about Acer Japonicum.
Acer Japonicum, the full moon Japanese maple, is one of our favorite Japanese maples. So this podcast is going to be a blast. I love Acer Japonicum and everything that tree brings to the garden and everything that tree is. We're the Mr. Maple Show on your favorite podcast platform. Make sure you're subscribed. And also find us on YouTube, because we do daily videos to our YouTube channel as well. We air the podcast version with the video component on YouTube on Sundays at 8 p.m. Feel free to check that out as well.
Guys, I'm Matt. As I mentioned before, that's my brother, Tim. We are maple crazy out here. We love talking about Japanese maples. We did a part one to this. We're kind of breaking down full moon maples. We did a part one basically where we talked about Acer Shirasawa and it being separated away from Acer Japonicum. We're going to give you a little bit more in-depth, deep dive on Acer Japonicum and just kind of go over it a little bit for you. Give us some from our opinion, some of our backstory, some of the knowledge, and just kind of get into Acer Japonicum, the full moon maple.
Now, Acer Japonicum was actually put in its own species around 1784. Some people credit Murray, some people credit Thunberg. It was separated. Acer Shirasawa was separated from Japonicum in the 1980s. We did a whole podcast on Acer Shirasawa, the full moon Japanese maple. These are both full moon Japanese maples, common names for both of them because they have that rounded foliage that looks very moon-like. I mean, amazing plants. Acer Japonicum in Japan, sometimes they call them Migetsu. Sometimes they refer to it as Ataya. If you see the word kaede in there, that just means maple. Sometimes they say Migetsu and Ataya. They're essentially saying full moon whenever they're saying Migetsu and Ataya.
Really cool plants. That's a native species of Japan, so we often classify this as a Japanese maple, specifically for that reason. It's also in section palmatus, so it hits again Japanese maple for that reason. Most Acer Japonicums are grafted to palmatum in the trade, and the reason why that is because palmatum heals quickly. So your common understock for Acer Japonicum is Acer palmatum subspecies palmatum. Japonicums could make it understock, but they typically heal a little bit slower, so they don't tend to make the best root stocks for production value.
Yeah, and we consulted a lot of the experts when we were doing grafting, and they often told us that Japonicums could take 14 to 16 days, where Acer palmatum can take 8 to 10 days. And the longer you have in that healing process means you get a lower take on your grafts. So Acer palmatum's, typically a better root stock, even for Japonicum selections, than Acer Japonicum is itself.
Now, coincidentally, the seeds actually take 2 years as well. So a little slower, a little larger on Acer Japonicums. Typically, if you're germinating Acer Japonicum seed, you'll have a few come up the first year, even if you stratify them in the refrigerator. Go watch our video on how to do seeds. Acer Japonicums will fool you, though, because a lot of times Acer Japonicums will take 2 years to germinate and come up. So don't give up on your Acer Japonicum seeds in 1 year.
I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why there may be so few varieties of Acer Japonicums out there, and that's because when that 2-year process of trying to go through seedlings, rats eat many of your seeds.
How many cool people have thrown out? How many cool seedlings have been thrown out by cool people not knowing to wait 2 years on their Acer Japonicums?
Oh yeah. But even on the people that wait, the rat, it's hard to keep mice out of your seed bed. I mean, that's such a problem whenever it comes to growing Japanese maples from seed. But Acer Japonicum, really big nutlets on the seeds, and it's one of these things where there may be ways around that. We've talked to some botanists who tell us that you can actually treat with chemicals to maybe get 1 year stratification. So that may be a trick that you can actually pull out with some of the Acer Japonicum seeds, so you don't have to wait that extra year. Now, I was reading on page 303 of Veritree's 4th edition, and it says that there's 2 native varieties that's been recorded by Jiburo Owi. One is Japonicum variety insular of the island Honshu, or from the Honshu area. And then the other is variety Koba koense, which is from the island of Hokkaido. And Hokkaido, it says, has sharper leaves and deeper lobes. And so this is just all, two varieties that I'm like, what in the world? I didn't know that there were different varieties of Japonicum. There's more in Japonicums than we even really know, and more that's really is described in detail in many books.
Yeah, if you get into the wild collecting seeds in Japan, there are many different regions where Japonicums are prominent. They're often, what we see as those big mountainous views of Japan, where you're looking at the aerial shots of Japan. You're seeing these amazing fall colors of oranges, reds, and yellows. And often what you're seeing there is native Japonicums in the landscape on those mountain ranges. They're very prominent in the Japanese Alps. They're also very prominent in the northern regions. Like Nikko is an area that has a lot of prominent Acer Japonicum.
It says also here there's a variety Stenolobum and a variety Villanosum. I mean, I did not even know that there were varieties of Japonicum, and you know that we're Mr. Maple. We love Japanese maples, and Japonicums are one of our favorites. I mean, there's so much in the world of Japonicum that's just opening up to people, and it's going to be more fun and interesting as time progresses and more people grow a lot of these Japonicum species, varieties, and selections.
Now, I love that our heroes were very much into selecting Ace Japonicums as well. We'll talk a little bit more about Masayoshi Yano. Yano-san was going through a ton of Japonicum seed as well. Now, Varieties was doing the same thing. Varieties was going through a lot of Aconitafolium seedlings. Now, we list Aconitafolium as Maiku jaku. We'll get into some of that in a few as well, but he was going through Aconitafolium seedlings. In his notes, we've been through the Oregon State Archives and looked at a lot of his notes, and a lot of what he was finding from Aconitafolium was cascading weeping forms and more lace leaf forms. That's where Oregon fern comes from, and green cascade. These are plants he was trading with another nurseryman named Art Wright, and so they were kind of exchanging some of their interesting Ace Japonicums. But it's interesting that Maiku jaku or Aconitafolium was leading to more of those weeping styles, more of those lace leaf, more divided characteristics for an Acer Japonicum, taking it even a little bit further than what had previously been seen.
In Veritrue's 4th edition, he says there's an opportunity in controlled hybridization to obtain additional interesting cultivars. And this is after he talks about how he's finding small cascading plants, multi-dissected leaves, bold uprights with exceptionally large leaves, circular foliage, all from Aconitafolium. And it's crazy that he is looking through these and thinking, man, all these are happening in my garden, and I'm not doing any controlled crossing. I'm just looking through seed, and this is what I'm finding. If someone took a breeding effort, they could possibly breed some other cool plants in there. And then it's interesting because with Billy Schwartz walking through Red Maple Nurseries, he also found gossamer underneath a different tree labeled Aconitafolium, a different variety of Aconitafolium.
They could be a little mixed up in the trade. A lot of what you see really, really early on, it's in some of the oldest arboretums for Aconitafolium, Aconitafolium. It all depends on how you want to do the Latin there. But you'll see a lot of those trees listed as something very similar to Vitafolium.
Yeah, I mean, Vitafolium, a little more division in the leaf itself, huge leaf. And I mean, it is a big Japonicum leaf, not as divided as Maiku jaku at all. I mean, Maiku jaku is almost like a frilly lace leaf upright, like a Matsumuri form of a Japonicum.
It makes a lot of sense why he was going through this to get more divisions and more weeping style forms, because it already has that heavy division in it.
Well, Billy Schwartz found a seedling gossamer, which is one of the most heavily dissected forms of Acer Japonicum, underneath this big leaf Acer Japonicum, and said, hey, this must have hybridized with one of these lace leaves to create this. And the interesting thing with Acer Japonicum is this really what's going on? Or is there, open genetics to explain this?
Is there that much variability within the species, or is it a hybrid with palmatum? Now, we'll get into a little bit of that later. We would definitely recommend checking out the Sue Weegriff podcast we did. She goes into some next level stuff, but we'll get into a little bit of that more. Some of the things we love most about Acer Japonicums, what really attracts you to Acer Japonicum, Tim, and what are some of your earliest memories? I'll start out there. What are your earliest memories with Acer Japonicum?
That's a tough, loaded question. I would say my earliest memory is with Maiku jaku. I think at the time it was sold in the nursery trade as Maiku and then space jaku. And so that's what most people were going with. Turns out that, May means dancing, kujaku means peacock. And so that actually is the spacing that should be there is May and then kujaku.
One of the most mixed up trees in the trade. You'll see it sold as fern leaf, aconitifolium, Maiku jaku, dancing peacock. And Maiku jaku does translate as dancing peacock, so it makes sense why a lot of people go with that translation. I would say Maiku jaku or dancing peacock are probably the best answers for what we should call it.
Yeah, and my dad, that was his first Acer Japonicum selection. He had about 20 varieties of Japanese maples before Matt and I really took the nursery and started growing it. And that was one of his first, 20 Japanese maples. And we fell in love with it. I mean, we started planting them everywhere.
Now, a lot of people will tell you that you should go with the original name, and they feel that the original name is aconitifolium. So we'll get to that controversy as well right now. I've actually looked up through Yano's book, and through Yano's research, he credits Maiku jaku back to 1888. So it's been around a minute. That's in the Sekehen Benron list. It's one of the older Japanese maple lists from the 1800s. What I see him photograph as Maiku jaku and dating back in Japan that far is the same plant as Maiku jaku. It's the same plant that has become aconitifolium. A lot of times trees left from Japan, went to Europe and were given Latin names, and then they're either reintroduced to America or they get back to Japan under a different name. And so that's how things can get mixed up there. I do think the original plant is the same, and Maiku jaku predates the naming of aconitifolium.
And Vertrees goes on further to say that some of the plants, like Feliciformis and aconitifolium, may have been the same plant originally as well, because they're indistinguishable, meaning the same plant may have came to Europe and gotten two different Latin names.
Right, multiple people brought it back, and then they said, I'll name it myself.
I guess it's a good tree then, right?
Right. So there could be some confusion there. We do list those things separately at our nursery in case there are future differences we find out, in petiole sizes or different nuances that we haven't quite known.
So Japonicum Maiku jaku, we fell in love with it early because it was just such a cool, and it was so distinctively different from many of the Acer palmatums. It was one of our entryway, our gateway drug into Acer Japonicums. And that for me was, and probably you too, also, your very first introduction to Acer Japonicum.
I mean, I remember Dad grafting it really early on. We were growing Maiku jaku, and we were selling out of it. And I would remember people telling us, I just can't sell those Japonicums. And we would sell every single 3-gallon Maiku jaku possible at our nursery. It was always something highly sought after. I guess we always kind of cultivated a more niche market than your basics. So it was something that people were always looking forward to getting. Whenever we had it in stock, we sold out of Maiku jaku. It is still one of our top selling Acer Japonicums. We've got a few prominent ones here in Maplewood Gardens at our parents' place, and they've been a great source for seed, but also for signwood. We've grafted a ton off those over the years, and it's always been kind of a staple at Mr. Maple.
Now, I would just remember early on just grafting with Dad, and those Acer Japonicum branches and the scions are so much thicker and bigger than many of the Acer palmatums. They were often one of the ones that I often, as a new grafter, shied away from because you had to have a better graft on that thicker wood. You had to have a better cut. And it was one of those things that whenever they took, you were just so excited because this was this thick scion that was grafted, and then all of a sudden this beautiful tree emerged. And even sometimes on a fresh young tree, they would throw on these large red blossoms, which is just outstanding. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But that was probably our earliest memories of Acer Japonicum. What is one of your more memorable moments of Acer Japonicum?
I took a picture of my wife, Amy, and standing next to our Maiku jaku in our yard. We plant way too many of these. I plant them everywhere. And I said, babe, you look better than Japanese maple in fall color. I thought that was the best compliment I'd ever given her person. She didn't think that was my greatest compliment since we've been married. But for me, that was heartfelt. That was from the heart. Now, everything about Acer Japonicums is unique. They're kind of bigger leaves, bigger foliage, thicker branching, as Tim mentioned. Now, one interesting thing about the branching, sometimes people will say, well, I don't like those V's in a tree. They make a weaker spot. You're naturally going to have a ton of V's in Acer Japonicum. They tend to throw on more V shapes than palmatum. So you're going to get a lot of growth from that natural habit. Now, it does tend to give a more upright habit for most of them, but you're going to have some V shapes going on in there, and it's going to be a tree that develops flowers in the early spring. Now, I was just out looking at my Maiku jaku the other day, same one I complimented Amy under, and there were bumblebees all over the thing. So I think an understated thing in this entire Japanese maple world is that bees love maple flowers, especially Acer japonicum.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the benefits that people don't think about as much is all these Japanese maples, they're pollinated by pollinators. They're not a wind pollination on Acer palmatum, Acer japonicum. Many of these maples in section palmatum, they're all pollinated by pollinators. And so they're running around to each of these little flowers out there. And on Acer japonicums, those blooms are huge. I mean,
they're very prominent tassel flowers. You notice them very well on Acer japonicums because most japonicums are green. So you're going to have that green spring color as well. And then you've got this red tassel flower that leaves out sometimes right before the flower. You'll start to get the tassel started. And then you get this very prominent bright red tassel flower dangling down from a green. And so that's very showy. The contrast between the two is really nice. Lush green foliage and bright red tassel flowers. I get bumblebees all over them and honeybees really on my Maiku jaku a good bit.
Now, when I think of that big japonicum leaf and those tassel flowers, I think of NJ Acer's iconic photo that he used on the UBC Maple Forum.
I've got it around here somewhere. We had it hanging on the wall at one point. We'll have to get it again.
Well, guess what, Matt? I've got it right here. And this thing is outstanding.
Editing.
It's got that gorgeous red flower right in the center of that large japonicum leaf on a Carolina blue sky background. I mean, how much more iconic of an Acer japonicum can you get than this photo that Ed Shin took?
Yeah, I believe he has this cultivar listed as a Taya. Again, a Taya meaning full moon there. Pretty cool cultivar to see. Iconic photo there for maples too. NJ Acer, such an important guy to Japanese maples.
And if you're listening on podcast, check out the YouTube version. There will be photos accompanied with this. That is such one of those things about japonicums that is so extremely showy. I mean, that bloom in the early spring, it's one of the better blooming Japanese maples in section palmatum. I think Acer erythrantrum may be the only other one that could compete with Acer japonicum for the flowers.
Not enough is done selecting maples for the flowers. We've got red maples, we've got erythrantrum, we've got some things that throw some incredible spring flower displays. And sometimes I think some of those colors and textures should be not ignored and written off.
Now, one of the things people often get so confused about in the early spring with Acer japonicum is those leaves when they're so big trying to bust out of those buds. They will sometimes be so big that they start busting out of the leaves early, but not in full leaf. I mean, they're still not...
I'll get people that ask me in December, they'll be like, I think my tree's leafing out. And sometimes Acer japonicum just has too much junk in the trunk. It can't get it all inside the bud. So you got a little bit tucked out there. It's some of it's hanging out. Sometimes you got a little bit of leaf hanging out, even in the dead of winter. Typically, that's not a problem at all. I mean, unless they're actually active and they're starting to leaf out, it's not a problem at all. It's a common trait to see Acer japonicum buds that are just too much leaf in there for the bud to shut completely.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy how those big leaves fit in those branches. I mean, it's really a clown car trick. I mean, how do they pull that leaf out of that bud? It's insane.
So you mentioned it a little bit, but the branches are thicker, so it can be a little intimidating when you're grafting it. The structure to them is distinctly different than the other species in section palmata. It's very easy to distinguish at Acer japonicum, but just looking at the branches, even out of leaf. So the buds are going to be larger, and those branches are going to be a little bit thicker. You're going to have to find a really nice size rootstock to graft at Acer japonicum sometimes because the soundwood has to line up with the rootstock. And so if you're grafting this into a palmatum, you may have to be putting it on something a little bit bigger than your smallest rootstocks.
So the fall color, that's one of the things I love most about these Acer japonicums. The fall color is one of the most outrageous of any of the palmatums, and it lasts longer. And I think that's because you've got that thicker foliage. I mean, I think it typically puts on a display that's typically a week or 2 weeks longer, but there's other reasonings that may sort of include why Acer japonicum has such a great fall color.
Yeah, Augustine was telling us that some studies have been done. We did a podcast with Augustine Coelho-Vera, and we also did a what is senescence video. So we kind of broke down senescence. Senescence is just a fancy word for fall color. And Augustine was basically saying that some studies have shown that the length of the days as it becomes shorter affects the japonicum fall color. So the length of the days can actually determine when the fall color starts. And that may lend itself to why Acer japonicums are so consistent in the fall. It might not be as temperature temperature or as moisture dependent as some other Acer species are, and leading it to be a little bit more consistent. Because Japonicums, it's hard to have a bad year with fall colors. Sometimes you'll get some of that marquescence where you get cold weather early and it can shut one down. But if you're going through natural progressions of fall, you're going to have great color on an Acer Japonicum.
Man, thinking about fall color on Acer Japonicum, my most memorable moment with Acer Japonicum was at Nico National Park at Ryuzu Falls.
It's a beautiful area. There's so many prominent Japonicums and Shirosaldums in the area. We talked about it in the Shirosaldum podcast as well. But Ryuzu Falls has some just huge leaf Japonicums there natively, and they're just everywhere. And I remember being so many, being enthralled with so many different colors. It was just tie-dye. You know, there was yellows, oranges, and reds everywhere you looked from the Acer Japonicums, and just outstanding plants.
In Japan, they call those people who search out maple fall color momiji-gare, which are maple hunters. And everyone during the fall are momiji-gare. They're running around, they're taking photos of all these Japanese maples in fall color, and people are just thrilled. I mean, it's the biggest tourist attraction is tracking down Japanese maples, and the Acer Japonicums, they're one of the highlights.
All right, y'all, we mentioned Sue Egriff earlier, and she's one of the just people at the forefront of Japanese maple breeding. She's one of the smartest people I know personally, and I love listening to her. If you haven't already, go back and check out that podcast with Sue Egriff. We did a full interview with her. I'll have to have her on again. Fascinating lady and someone who just knows so much about Japanese maples. So she said that she believed there was a natural barrier between breeding Acer Japonicum and Acer palmatum, and that lead to be why you see less influence from palmatum like you do in something like, say, Acer Shirosaldum.
And that would mean that much of what we're seeing with Acer Japonicum is breeding with other Japonicums and seeing different variations from, just natural variation, which would be, it's crazy. I mean, that you can get from gossamer to vitafolium is just outrageous that there's that much variation in the genetics of Acer Japonicum.
Now, I will tell you, when I was at Westernbird Arboretum, I saw a tree. It was in the old Arboretum. I've asked the dendrologist Dan Growley about this several times, and he looks at me like I'm crazy. I saw this tree. I have pictures of it. I'll throw a picture in here. I was walking around with Peter Gregory and Hugh Angus at Westernbird Arboretum, and there was a tree in the old garden listed Acer Japonicum X palmatum, and the thing was just going full Hulkamania. It was yellow and red. It gave the appearance of an Amoenum style Japonicum. I'll have to get to the bottom of this one. I always wanted to graft this one and name it after Peter Gregory just because of the fond memory I had going around there with him. Maybe somebody at Westonburg can get back to me, but every time I've talked to the dendrologists who study the trees there, they act like I made this up. So maybe it was just mythological. It just appeared on this wondrous day with Peter Gregory.
I'm sure they all know there's that natural barrier that Sue Egriff has discussed in her breeding projects.
So maybe it was a natural Japonicum.
Yeah, but there's also, when there's rules rules that are meant to be broken. I mean, just because there's a natural barrier all the time doesn't mean that there's not one of those varieties we talked about of Acer Japonicum that doesn't have that natural barrier like the Japonicum that was studied did. But I often wondered, because the majority of the natural barriers are, bloom times that are at different time frames, or this Acer Japonicum has a long distance away from the Acer palmatum, so they'll never crossbreed. But the natural barrier that Sue was talking about, I almost thought it was going to be a chromosomal difference because the branches are thicker on Japonicums. Everything's bigger. Mm-hmm. And I thought there must be a different chromosome count. And then when I started doing some research, one of our friends, Ryan Contreras at Oregon State University, him and Kim Shearer, another one of our friends, did a study on the ploidy of wild collected Acer. And in that, they determined that Acer Japonicum that they were studying and Acer palmatum had the same ploidy. Mm-hmm. So there's another natural barrier there that's happening besides just chromosomes.
It's interesting. If you talk to Billy Schwartz, who we also did a podcast with, he believes that gossamer is an Acer Japonicum X palmatum dissectum. It may just be an expression of the variability from within Japonicum. That's kind of what I lean toward, is that it actually is just part of the variability that's possible with the species of Japonicum. Maybe some people can do some testing on these and let us know. I've got some friends that do some genetic testing on maples, and we can get to the bottom of that one, whether it's truly a hybrid with palmatum or if we're just seeing the most extreme lace leaf dainty form of Japonicum being expressed.
Now, Japonicums, there's such a wide range of Acer Japonicums. The growing conditions on them vary from cultivar to cultivar, but we're going to tell you some conditions that are typically good for most Acer Japonicum selections in most climates. A morning sun to afternoon shade or filtered light is going to do really well for most Acer Japonicum cultivars.
Yeah, this is going to give you your larger foliage. A lot of people are always asking which is the largest foliage Japonicum, and conditions can change that a good bit. If you're growing an Acer Japonicum in full sun, the foliage is going to be a little bit smaller than it would be with those big tropical looking leaves if you have it in, some shadier conditions or a late day shade.
Yeah, I think the biggest I've ever actually seen, whenever I first saw Yamakagi, for instance, at Don Schmidt Nursery, I put my hand right next to the tree, the foliage, and my mind was just blown how big the leaf was. Later, we were at Iroki Gardens in New York in a filtered light setting, and we saw Woods number 2, and we're talking, it was probably every bit of 2.5 foot on an actual leaf. It was the biggest leaf I'd ever seen on an Acer Japonicum. That filtered light, that afternoon shade, caused that leaf to get larger. And when it does that, it just is crazy, crazy awesome.
So good drainage is key there. You want slightly acidic soils, just like with most Japanese maples. Good drainage is very paramount still with Acer Japonicums. They're grafted to palmatum primarily, but even if they're on their own roots, they don't want to be in a boggy or wet condition. Really indicative of the species, one good, well-drained soil. Now, we'll get into a few of the characteristics of some of the cultivars, and I will give you a breakdown of all the cultivars that are known in the United States. I think Tim and I have at least one of every single Acer Japonicum cultivar. Spoiler alert, I think we get close to like 45. That's under 50, but we can get you pretty high up there in numbers for Acer Japonicum selections.
So if you're looking to collect a type of species or a type of, a Japanese maple, collecting Japonicums would definitely be a fun thing to do. It'd be really difficult but it's actually an under 50. So a lot of people could have 50 trees in their garden. So something to consider, collecting all the Acer Japonicums.
Now, among the largest leaves are Rising Sun, Yamakagi, and Ed Wood. Sometimes Ed Wood is just referred to as Woods number 2. I also have some speculation. I know that Woods number 1 became eventually Algiton.
Yeah.
Now, Rising Sun was named by Isley Nursery. I've never confirmed this, but I always wonder if either Woods number 2 or a various seedling of Woods number 2 became Rising Sun, because there are some similarities there. I've never been able to confirm that. I can't tell you if how different those two truly are. Rising Sun tends to be more vigorous for us.
Yeah, than
Ed Wood.
And Yamakagi definitely has a different origin story. It was a chance seedling in Don Schmidt or Jim Schmidt's neighborhood, and the neighborhood was Mountain Shadows subdivision, which Yamakagi translates as Mountain Shadows.
Now, also in that list would have to be Talon Buckholt's introduction, Giant Moon. Also really large foliage on Giant Moon. Talon introduction that's just got great foliage.
And Giant Moon probably has one of the more circular leaves of the Japonicums, where the other three we mentioned have very oblong leaves.
A little more Maiku jaku style.
A little more divided and a little more oblong on the leaf.
We're giving out some superlatives here. So most popular, best dressed, all right, most vigorous would definitely have to go to Emmett's pumpkin. That tends to be the Japonicum that fills out in the garden the quickest. It's not uncommon for 1 gallon to be 1.5 feet. It's not uncommon for this tree to grow over 1.5 feet a year. I tend to put this one at 10 to 12 foot in 10 years. Because it's not uncommon for it to be more than 1 foot of growth a year.
It's also one of the ones that appears to be more sun tolerant than many of the other Japonicums. But it doesn't have a small leaf either. I mean, it's honorable mention on those largest leaves. I mean, it's got a decent sized leaf to it as well, and that bright pumpkin orange fall color where it gets its name, Emmett's pumpkin.
Absolutely cool plant. Now, smallest, we'll throw in Gossamer and Fairy Lights. We talked a little about Gossamer coming from Billy Schwartz, Red Maple Nursery's introduction. Fairy Lights actually comes from Australia. This is a very popular, small, compact form. And I thought it's so aptly named because when it hits those flowers, it's just got a little fairy light all over it.
Hey, you can actually throw another shrimp on the Barbie for that one.
Right. It's a great plant, actually, from Australia. This one's from Yamina Rare Plant Nursery, and it's quintessential for the fairy garden, for the compact small garden. You're going to get all the lovely foliage of an Acer Japonicum with kind of a light, weeping, graceful habit to it in a small, compact setting.
I mean, Fairy Light's perhaps one of the smallest. Gossamer perhaps the most lace leaf version. I mean, it may be the smallest as well. I mean, it is in that running for smallest Acer Japonicum, but the threads of the lace leaf are so small. And the unique thing to me about gossamer is it almost seems like a color variation, because you can get some silver gray kind of colors out of gossamer that you can't really get out of many of the other Japonicums as well, which leads me to wonder, is it a hybrid? Is it that one chance hybrid that actually happened, or is it just genetic variation?
Now, you've got listed here most popular Maiku, jaku, aka aconitifolium. I would say Fairy Lights could definitely give that a run for its money if it was equal in production here at Mr. Maple. So we normally have less Fairy Lights than Maiku, jaku. For the trade overall, aconitifolium, most commonly sold Acer Japonicum. You'll see it in garden centers as aconitifolium. Again, sometimes as fern leaf, which I hate that name. That's like least favorite way to call that one. Or Maiku, jaku, or dancing peacock. Again, tell all those people they're wrong. They're not arguing with me, guys. They're arguing with Yano-san. And Yano-san says 1888, and he is correct on Maiku, jaku.
I think the reason why we hate the name fern leaf so bad is because we were at a Master Gardener conference, and the head of the Master Gardener conference came up and looked at our Japanese maples and said, "Y'all got some pretty ferns." And that
we won't say what state. We'll leave that ambiguous.
That just struck us the wrong way so much that when we hear fern leaf for Maiku, jaku, we're like, don't call it a fern.
All right, so last up here for superlatives, but actually I'll throw in one more. Before we get to variegated, I'll throw in spring color, because there's actually some fun variants for spring color now. NJ Acer, who we mentioned earlier, used the term blushing for blushing beauty. And so there's a few different Acer Japonicums that have this. A lot of them can. Now, they can all be conditional and have it each season, but there are a few selections made for having it quite regularly. Blushing Beauty is one named by NJ Acer that has a very regular blushing of pink-red. Orange Fan is one named by Talon Buchholz that has a regular spring blushing of like a more orangey bright hue. You certainly can see the same kind of bright hue happen with Emmett's Pumpkin as well.
Yeah, I mean, those things can give some amazing spring color out there. Next, we've got the Acer Japonicum selections that are variegated. We've got Kujaku Nishiki and Maiku Nishiki.
I've got hopes for Maiku Nishiki. A lot of people saw that walkthrough we did, our top 5 most outrageous plants at Buchholz. It was, spoiler alert, it was number 6. It was the surprise last one listed there at Buchholz Nursery. It has a ghost-like variegation that I hope is more stable. We're still experiencing this one, kind of building our experience with it, I should say, and learning more about this one. Definitely going to need some late-day shade for a Japonicum that's reticulated like a ghost. Now, Kujaku Nishiki, I first saw that at Don Schmidt's house, Jim Schmidt's house, when we were visiting, and Jim Schmidt walked us around, showed us that one, and for me, it's been incredibly unstable. It was always a showstopper. It was always this beautiful plant. But from grafting, it always tends to lose that cyclical variegation. It has some little swirls in it. It tends to just wash out pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's very much in that Tama Nishiki, Fujinami Nishiki era of
I would
things.
say even less stable. I mean, at least with those, you can prune it. This one, it would be like the next spring, you would just be green.
Yeah, I mean, we've lost a lot of hope for a variegated Kujaku Nishiki in the nursery trade. And we've tried many, many times. We've tried with plants from Japan. We've tried with plants from all over the world. And unfortunately, it's been one that's been very unstable for us.
So Maiku Nishiki remains the great white hope for Japonicums. we'll hope that it pans out. We're still learning about that one. There are some incredible Acer Japonicums out there, though, guys. I mentioned I would tease you with a list. I recently had a customer put together a list of 36 Acer Japonicums. Now, it goes a little further than that. Like I said, I can get you a lot closer to 50. Now, there are some variances that we don't count as cultivars. We'll start out with Abby's Weepin'. These are alphabetical, but I'll throw a few in at the end that weren't in that first list. Aka Amote, some people would argue, might not be Japonicum. There's some debate. A lot of people listen to Shirosawara, which we know is incorrect. Tim and I can look at it and tell you that might not be the case. One thing that we thought was interesting is there might be a larger ability to cross Acer Japonicum with Acer Seboldianum and Acer Pseudoseboldianum. Potentially.
I mean, that may be why we have Yayoi Gasa with such big leaves. It may be a hybrid between the two.
Now, Akamote certainly has a more upright shape and a little bit different branching than a lot of the other Acer Japonicums. It still has foliage that we think of a lot like an Acer Japonicum. And then we're also wondering if Yayoi Gasa kind of fits that mold some too. So next up, we've got Algiton, Talon Buckholz introduction, Weeping Form.
Edward number 1.
Yeah, originally Edward number 1. So if you ever seen Edward number 1, don't pick that one up as well. Atari.
Yeah, Atari. That's a classic. You don't see that one too much in the nursery trade anymore.
You just hit the one bit where you hit the ball back and forth. Play. So Aurora Borealis. Now that's a deep cut. We'll be bringing that one back at Mr. Maple. Aurora Borealis is a more Maiku jaku style plant with that divided leaf. Introduction by Billy Schwartz. That's one we'll be doing again. Autumn Glory, Blushing Beauty, Branford Beauty, Charlotte Helene, which may not be Japonicum. We're still looking at a few of these from overseas to see. Straight Dissectum, so Acer Japonicum Dissectum, Emmett's Pumpkin, Fairy Lights, Felicifolium, Giant Moon, Gossamer, Green Cascade, Indian Summer, the Japonicum form of Irish Lace. Don't let that one confuse you. There's an Acer Japonicum Irish Lace and an Acer Palmatum Dissectum Irish Lace. Italia, Longwood. That was a selection by Longwood Gardens in Pennsylvania. Again, similar to Maiku jaku, a little different fall color. Maiku jaku, Maiku nishiki, Megitsu. Now, often there's Megitsu Italia, and Megitsu listed separately, so all three of those could be potentials. Nyx Weepin, Oasami, Orange Fan, Oregon Fern, Otaki, Rising Sun, which again, I'm wondering if it has some similarities to a few other ones. Shuriken. Now, that's another one that's listed as a hybrid Japonicum. I've got some reservations about that. I don't know. I'd have to do some genetic testing. We do throw it in as Acer Japonicum because that's the way it was listed. Maybe some other influences going on there. I'm not sure. Takinagawa, Vitifolium, Woods, which again is Woods number 2, and Yamakagi. Now, there's some other selections out there too that I mentioned. I did mention that there was a hybrid Palmatum Japonicum at Westenbert. Tim and I offer, but we don't consider them cultivars, wild collected 1 and 2 of Acer Japonicum. So those are 2 Japonicums that you'll see out there that are not cultivars, but they are genetic differences from the other Japonicums.
There's some Japonicums that were collected at the Shirabisu Pass, and it's interesting because, you know, we've already included Megitsu, Ataya, and Megitsu Ataya, but there's actually multiple forms of all of those. Because
seems like it.
When they brought Japanese maples from Japan, when people would say, hey, what's this? They would say, oh, it's Megitsu. Well, we mentioned earlier, that just means Acer Japonicum.
Mm-hmm.
And so they said, oh, it's Ataya. Oh, okay, that's Acer Japonicum, and then they'd say, oh, that's Megitsu Ataya.
Now, there are several, not on this list, that we've recently started growing here, and we'll have to evaluate these to make sure they are Japonicum. But I know 3 that Dick Wolf named: Acer Japonicum Thomas, Acer Japonicum David, and Acer Japonicum DE Collection. Now, those are yet to be seen, you know, if we confirm whether we feel they're Japonicum or not as we grow those out more. An interesting one, Feliciformis, can typically only be found in Ed Shin's garden, and it seems like a very small leaf form of Maiku jaku, which seems distinctly different than a few of the other ones out there. Parent Gossamer, again, a lot like the original
Aconautifolium.
Yeah, and also a little bit like the original Vitifolium. We do list that one separate. Now, not listed in that original listing was Kujaku Nishiki. And then there's also several interesting ones. Tim and I are working on a potential one called Moon Dance. I hadn't really made cultivar status yet, but that's a potential one. And I'll let you guys know that Yano-san had about 8 to 10 selections of Acer Japonicum that he was going through that he listed. Some of them have names. They're not in the U.S. typically, but there's some really cool Japonicums that Yano-san was selecting.
And there may also be some other ones that are in Europe right now that are not in the United States as well. There's quite a few Acer Japonicums that are just being selected or being named in Europe that might hit the market in the next few years.
Sure, these are some of the known ones inside the United States. But yeah, really cool traits going on there.
Not a big list.
Not a big list. I mean, yeah, I think we get to 45 there minus the Yano ones right about. Yeah, and with Yano's ones, you could put it over 50.
That's insane. Acer Japonicum, it's so amazing in every way. The full moon Japanese maple.
Just thought of another one. Acer Japonicum Levette.
Oh, yeah.
Another one you see at Ed Shin's garden, but not a lot of other places.
That is really interesting. And that's not the Acer Pseudosubuldianum selection. That is the Japonicum selection of Levette.
Another one's similar to Maiku jaku. It's got that more divided foliage.
Smaller foliage as well, though.
Yeah, there's some different nuances you'll see to a few of these. Not many of them out there, though, but some really cool plants. I think Acer Japonicum, one of the more unique plants, something that everybody kind of gets fired up about. Like, everybody asks me when we're going to have more Acer Japonicums. I know those 3 specifically from Dick Vandermatt will be doing numbers in as we get them up.
I do also know there is the Acer Japonicum X Pseudosubuldianum Osiris that was bred by Piet de Jong, or found by Piet de Jong.
Yeah, good call on that.
So there's that one as well. And I think that a lot of the ways that people will start finding Acer Japonicum interesting things is hybridizing them with some of these other species. They might not directly cross with Acer palmatum, but by crossing it with Pseudosubuldianum, we might skip that barrier between Acer palmatum and then be able to cross something like Osiris with something like Ryusin.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many ways to use it as like a bridge species, like Acer Pseudosubuldianum or Acer oliveranum, to try to hybridize Acer Japonicum with the Acer palmatums and start getting more of that Japonicum influence and that palmatum influence together.
There's about 10 here at Mr. Maple that are in that. There's seedlings that are in that 10-year age range. We haven't officially put any of them into the trade yet, but there's some of those that could potentially get to cultivar status as well. So we are selecting there. It's just we're in the long haul of that. So we want to make sure they're actually interesting. With Acer Japonicums, if we put one out, we want it to be pretty special.
Yeah, it's got to be unique. And it's got to be something that stands out from everything else that's out there. And there's 50 different varieties out there. We don't need another Oregon fern. We don't need another green cascade.
Right.
We need something that's going to stand on its own as a unique cultivar. And Acer Japonicum is the full moon Japanese maple. One of the most beautiful trees that's out in the gardens today. Everybody falls in love with them the very first time you see an Acer Japonicum, because there's nothing quite like a full moon Japanese maple.
Now, we hope you've liked this brief overview. Again, if you enjoyed this, definitely check out our Acer Shirasawanum. Let us know if you'd like to see one on Pseudosubuldianum and Seaboldianum. That may be something we could break down species-wise for you. Just kind of a different style video here, not a countdown or anything like that, but just kind of sitting down, having a discussion with you guys about some of our favorite Japanese maples. This one kind of being a little bit more of a deep dive into Acer Japonicum. Now, if you like this kind of content, make sure to give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platforms or Google reviews. That always works great as well.
Take care.
God bless.
And have a great day.